What would you do if you traveled 300 miles across the country to marry a man you'd only ever met in letters, only to step off the stagecoach and see another woman standing there, holding a letter from the very same man? That's the nightmare Tarnia McCall walked into. But that's not the crazy part. The crazy part is what happened 30 minutes later, when the man they both came to marry was lying broken and bleeding in the street. One of them would walk away in disgust. The other would pick him up, throw him over her shoulder, and carry him home. This story is a wild ride, and the ending is something you will never see coming. So stick with me, because we're heading to Grey Rock, Montana, and things are about to get messy. The wheels of the stagecoach barely stopped turning before the doors flew open. Out of one side stepped a woman who looked like she just walked out of a Kansas City catalog. Her hair was the color of spun gold, pinned up so perfect you'd think the wind was scared of it. Her dress was clean, pressed, and probably cost more than the horse that pulled it. This was Violet Rollins. She held her chin high, like she was daring the dusty little town of Grey Rock to disappoint her. Then from the other side, another woman stepped down. This one was different. Her hands were rough from work, not from holding teacups. Her dress was simple, made for moving, not for show. Her eyes, well, her eyes looked like they'd seen too many sunrises after too many sleepless nights. This was Tarnia McCall. In her pocket was a single faded letter that had been her only hope for the last 3 months. They saw each other across the dusty platform, and in that one look, they both knew. They knew they had a problem. Violet's lips curled into a smile that wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile a wolf gives before it eats. "Well, well," she said, her voice loud enough for the whole town square to hear. "Looks like someone got their wires crossed." A crowd was gathering. Small towns live for this kind of drama. Mrs. Henderson, the postmaster's wife, and the town's unofficial news source, bustled forward. "You two ladies here for the wedding?" she asked, her eyes darting between them. "I am," Violet declared, smoothing a non-existent wrinkle from her skirt. "Mr. Jedediah Clark and I have been corresponding for months. He's expecting me." Tarnia felt the ground fall out from under her. Jedediah Clark, the same name on her letter, the man who had written with such kindness, such promise. She'd read his words over and over, imagining the man who wrote them. Strong, honest, a man you could build a life with. She had bet her entire future on that man, and now this perfect-looking woman was claiming him as her own. Tarnia clutched her satchel, the worn leather cool against her sweaty palm. She had nothing. No family left, no farm to go back to. Just the 300 miles of dust she'd eaten to get here, and a heart full of hope that was quickly turning to ash. Violet's smile widened. She looked Tarnia up and down, taking in the cheap fabric of her dress, the exhaustion on her face. It was a look of pure dismissal. "I'm sure it's just a simple misunderstanding," she said, though her tone made it clear she thought Tarnia was either a fool or a liar. But before Tarnia could even find her voice to defend herself, a shout cut through the air. It came from the end of Main Street, a man's voice raw with panic. "It's Jed! The wagon's overturned!" The whole town square seemed to lurch. People started running, their chatter turning into a roar of alarm. A cloud of dust was rising down the street, and through it, Tarnia could see it. A farm wagon flipped on its side, one wheel spinning uselessly in the air like a broken clock. Jed Clark. The crowd surged forward, and the two women, enemies just a moment before, were swept along with it. They both ran, shoving through the chaos, driven by the same terrifying thought. They had to see the man they came to marry. What they found was a nightmare. It wasn't the strong, handsome rancher from their letters. The man on the ground was a wreck. Jed Clark was lying in the dirt, his leg twisted at an angle that made your stomach churn. His face was a mask of mud and blood, his nice clothes ripped to shreds. He was barely conscious, groaning as the town doctor knelt over him. This was the man with the biggest ranch in the county? This broken thing in the mud? Then Jed's eyes fluttered open. They were hazy with pain, searching the crowd of faces above him. His lips moved and one word came out, a desperate, broken whisper. "Violet?" Every single eye in that crowd turned to the golden-haired woman. This was her moment. The man she'd traveled all this way for was calling her name. reaching for her with a trembling, dirt-caked hand. This was the moment she was supposed to rush to his side, to be the angel of mercy. Violet stared down at him. Her perfect, polished mask began to crack. This was not what she had signed up for. The man in her letters was powerful, confident, successful. He wrote about his vast lands, his growing herd, the big house he'd built with his own two hands. He was a pillar of the community, a man who could give her everything she'd ever wanted: security, status, a life free from worry. The man in the dirt was none of those things. He was weak, helpless, covered in filth and bleeding in front of the entire town. He was a patient, a burden. The whole town held its breath, watching. What would the beautiful bride-to-be do? Violet took one small step back, then another. Her lip curled in a tiny, almost imperceptible sneer of disgust. She looked at the blood, at the mud, at the raw, pleading vulnerability in his eyes. "I can't," she whispered, but in the dead silence her voice carried like a gunshot. This isn't what I expected." And then she turned. Without another look, without another word, she turned her back on the man who had called her name and walked away. Her fancy skirt swished through the dust, a sound of finality. The crowd parted for her, their faces a mix of shock and scorn. They watched her walk all the way back to the boarding house and disappear inside. Jed's eyes followed her until she was gone. And as the door to the boarding house closed, something inside him seemed to shatter all over again. The pain from his broken leg was nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the crushing weight of being rejected like that. So publicly, so completely. The show was over. The crowd started to break apart, shaking their heads, muttering to themselves. The doctor was calling for men to help him move Jed to his office. The drama had played out, and everyone was ready to go home and gossip about it. Everyone except Tarnia. While the rest of the town had been watching Violet's grand exit, Tarnia had been watching Jed. She wasn't looking at the blood or the dirt. She was looking at his face. And underneath the pain and the mud, she saw it. The strong line of his jaw, the stubborn set of his mouth. She saw the hands that, even limp with injury, were calloused and capable. This was a man who worked, a man who built things. This was the man from the letters. Not the pretty words, but the man between the lines. Violet had seen a broken man. Tarnia saw a man worth saving. She walked forward, setting her old satchel down in the dust. The few people still lingering watched her, confused. What was this other woman doing? "Dr. Morrison," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "How bad is he?" The doctor looked up, surprised. "Broken leg, clean through. Nasty knock on the head. He'll live, but he won't be on his feet for a good long while." Tarnia just nodded. Then she did something that made the entire town of Grey Rock stop dead in its tracks for the second time in 10 minutes. She knelt down beside Jed Clark. She worked her arms under his shoulders and knees, and with a grunt of effort that seemed impossible for a woman her size, she lifted him. She lifted the full-grown, unconscious man clear off the ground and onto her back in a fireman's carry. The remaining crowd let out a collective gasp. A couple of men, shamed into action, rushed forward to help. "Here, miss, let us take him." Tarnia shifted his weight, her jaw set with determination. "No, thank you," she said, her voice strained but steady. "I've got him. Which way is his ranch?" Mrs. Henderson scurried over, her face a mess of confusion. "Child, you can't be serious. You don't even know this man." Tarnia looked at the postmaster's wife, and her eyes were 100 years old. "Maybe not," she said, "but he knows my name. And right now, that's enough." And with that, she started walking. She carried Jed Clark straight through the middle of town, past the gawking faces, past the whispers and the stares. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't know what she would find when she got there. All she knew was that this man needed help, and everyone else, including the woman he had chosen first, had walked away. But Tarnia McCall wasn't built for walking away. She was built for walking toward trouble. And as she carried the weight of this stranger on her back, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like she was finally heading home. The Clark Ranch was a kingdom carved out of the Montana wilderness. As Tarnia, guided by Jed's occasional groans and half-conscious directions, crested the final hill, the sight of it stole what little breath she had left. A solid two-story ranch house with a wide porch stood like a fortress against the rolling plains. Barns and corrals, all in perfect repair, spread out around it. Horses, sleek and powerful, grazed peacefully in a pasture. This wasn't just a ranch, it was an empire. This was what Jed Clark had built, and it was what Violet Rollins had just thrown away. As Tarnia staggered toward the main house, a man burst out of the largest barn. He was tall and lean, with a thick mustache and eyes that missed nothing. He took one look at the strange woman carrying his boss over her shoulder, and his hand went straight to the pistol on his hip. "What in the hell?" he growled, his voice like gravel. "He's hurt," Tarnia panted, her legs shaking with exhaustion. "Wagon overturned in town." The man's eyes widened. He holstered his gun and rushed forward. "Jed, boss!" He helped Tarnia ease Jed through the door and onto the big bed in the main bedroom. This was Clint Vaughn, the ranch foreman. He moved with a quiet efficiency, barking orders at other ranch hands who appeared as if from nowhere. As they worked to cut away Jed's torn clothes and clean his wounds, Tarnia learned the basics. Clint had been with Jed for 8 years, his right-hand man since the beginning. He was fiercely loyal, and his worry for Jed was so thick you could feel it in the air. After they had Jed settled and waiting for the doctor, Clint finally turned his full attention to Tarnia. He looked her up and down, his gaze sharp and assessing. "You ain't what I was expecting," he said. "What do you mean?" "The bride," Clint said, crossing his arms. "Jed's been going on for weeks about his mail-order bride. Violet said she was refined, educated, a real lady." Tarnia looked down at her own plain dress, now stained with Jed's blood in the dust of the road. "I'm not Violet. I can see that," Clint said, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. "So who are you?" Tarnia met his gaze. "I'm the one who stayed." The doctor arrived and confirmed everything. The leg was a bad break. The concussion was serious. Jed would recover, but it would take weeks, maybe months. He would be completely helpless. "He's gonna need round-the-clock nursing," Dr. Morrison said, packing his bag. "Someone to feed him, tend to him. He can't be left alone." Clint shifted on his feet, looking worried. He was a foreman, not a nurse. The other hands were cowboys, not caretakers. "Violet's not here," Tarnia said quietly, speaking into the heavy silence. "But I am." The doctor and Clint both stared at her. "Miss," the doctor said gently, "you sure about this? It's a hard job, nursing a man that's busted up, especially a stranger." Tarnia thought about the failed farm in Kansas, the endless, thankless jobs in other people's houses, the feeling of never belonging anywhere. She looked at the man lying unconscious in the bed. He wasn't a stranger. He was a chance. "He's the man who wrote me," she said. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was a piece of it. She had answered the same advertisement. She had dreamed of the same life. Maybe, just maybe, destiny had gotten the envelopes mixed up. That night, as the ranch settled into a heavy quiet, Tarnia sat by Jed's bedside. The house was filled with the scent of pine and leather. It smelled like stability, like permanence. She pulled out the letter from her pocket, the one she had written to Jed but had been too afraid to send. In it, she hadn't just asked for a husband. She'd poured out her heart, telling him about her dream of a home, a place to put down roots. She wondered what would have happened if she'd sent it. The next morning she was up before the sun, and the smell of coffee, bacon, and fresh biscuits filled the ranch house. The ranch hands, a crew of 6 rough-looking cowboys, filed into the kitchen and stopped dead, their eyes wide with surprise. They stared at the stacks of pancakes, the platters of eggs, the quiet woman standing at the stove, as if she'd been there her whole life. Clint was the last to enter. He watched her for a long moment, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "You don't have to do this, you know," he said. Tarnia flipped a pancake with a practiced flick of her wrist. "Yes," she said, not looking at him. "I do." "Why?" She finally turned, her eyes meeting his. "Because someone needs to," she said, "and because I'm tired of running." In the days that followed, Tarnia became the silent, beating heart of the Clark Ranch. She tended to Jed with a gentle competence that amazed everyone. She changed his bandages, spoon-fed him broth, and read to him from the books on his shelves when the pain kept him awake. But she didn't just stay in the sick room. During the day, she learned the rhythms of the ranch. She had a way with the horses, a calm authority that the animals seemed to understand. She helped mend fences, her hands as skilled as any man's. She learned the names of every man on the crew, listened to their stories, and remembered the little things, like how young Bobby missed his mother's cooking, or how old Pete's joints ached in the cold. The ranch began to change. The men who had been somber and worried started to smile again. There was more laughter at the dinner table. They worked with a new purpose, a new sense of pride. They weren't just working for a paycheck anymore. They were working for Jed, and they were working for the quiet, tough woman who had shown up out of nowhere and held the whole place together. "She's got more grit than a whole platoon of soldiers," Clint remarked to the others one evening, as they watched Tarnia calmly stitch up a cut on a spooked horse that wouldn't let anyone else near it. But as the weeks passed, Tarnia started to notice something strange. Jed was getting better. He was more lucid each day. He would talk to her, ask her questions about her life, about Kansas. His eyes, clear and intelligent, followed her everywhere she went. But there was a secret in them, something he was hiding. It started with the get-well cards that came from town. Mrs. Henderson brought a stack of them. Tarnia offered to read them to Jed, but he always waved her off. "Just tell me who they're from," he'd say gruffly. Then there was the ranch ledger. Clint would bring it in every evening, and he and Jed would talk over the numbers. But Tarnia noticed that Jed never actually looked at the book. He would just listen as Clint read the figures aloud, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place one rainy afternoon. Tarnia was cleaning out a dusty roll-top desk in the study when she found it. Tucked away in a back drawer was a stack of papers. They were drafts of letters, letters to prospective brides. She saw Violet's name on one, and on another, scrawled and corrected many times, were the exact same words from the letter she had received. But the handwriting wasn't the elegant, confident script from the letter in her pocket. This handwriting was rough, almost childish. And it wasn't Jed's. It was Clint's. A cold dread washed over her. The man in the bed, the man she was starting to care for, the man whose ranch she was running, was a fraud. The kind, eloquent words that had drawn her all the way to Montana hadn't been his at all. They belonged to his foreman. Who was Jedediah Clark? And what other secrets was he hiding? That night, the air in the sick room was thick with unspoken questions. Tarnia sat in her usual chair, the mending basket in her lap, but her hands were still. Jed watched her. He could feel the change in her, the new distance. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice stronger now. "What is it?" Tarnia took a deep breath. She wouldn't accuse. She would just ask. "Jed, can you read?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had ever heard. Jed's face, which had been slowly regaining its healthy color, went pale. He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the rough wooden beams of the ceiling. For a long time he said nothing. "No," he finally said, the word barely a whisper. "Never learned. My father said reading was for soft men. Said a man needed a strong back, not a head full of words." He took a ragged breath. "Clint. He writes my letters. Reads them to me. Always has." The confession hung in the air between them. It wasn't an excuse. It was just the plain, painful truth. He was a man who had built an empire with his bare hands, a man respected and feared throughout the territory, but he couldn't read his own name. It was a secret shame he had carried his whole life. Tarnia looked at him, at this powerful man made so vulnerable, and the cold dread in her stomach melted away, replaced by a wave of something warm and fierce. She didn't feel cheated. She felt closer to him. She finally understood the shadow in his eyes. "Why me?" she asked softly. Why did Clint write to me?" "I told him what to look for," Jed said, his eyes still on the ceiling. "Someone strong, a worker, someone who understood what it meant to build something from nothing. Your advertisement, it was different from the others. You didn't talk about wanting security or a fine house. You talked about wanting a home, a place to put down roots." His voice cracked. "That's all I've ever wanted, too." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were raw with unshed tears. "I'm sorry I deceived you, Tarnia. I should have told you." Tarnia stood up and walked to his bedside. She reached out and took his large, calloused hand in hers. "There's nothing to be sorry for," she said. "A man isn't what he can write on a piece of paper. He's what he does. And I've seen what you do, Jed Clark. I've seen what you've built. That's the man I came here for." Something shifted in the room. A wall that had stood between them crumbled into dust. Jed squeezed her hand, a look of profound gratitude, of awe on his face. He was falling in love with her. He knew it with a certainty that shook him to his core. This quiet, unassuming woman who had carried him, nursed him, and now accepted his deepest shame without a flicker of judgment. She was more real, more true, than any woman he had ever known. A few weeks later, Jed was back on his feet, leaning on a cane but getting stronger every day. Autumn was turning the Montana landscape into a canvas of golden red. The ranch was thriving, more efficient and more peaceful than ever before. Tarnia had become its soul. One evening they sat on the porch together, watching the sun dip below the mountains. The comfortable silence between them was a language all its own. "Tarnia," Jed said, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to ask you something." He turned to her, his face serious. "I know this isn't how it was supposed to happen. I know I'm not the man you read about in those letters. I'm just me, a rancher who can't read, a man who was left for dead in the street." He took a deep breath. "But I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you, Tarnia McCall. I think I started loving you the moment I woke up and found you here, refusing to leave." He slid off his chair, wincing as he knelt on his bad leg. He didn't have a ring. He didn't have a fancy speech prepared by Clint. He just had the honest, simple truth. "Will you marry me? Will you stay and build this life with me?" Tears streamed down Tarnia's face, but they were tears of pure joy. This was real. This wasn't about a letter or a promise. This was about two people who had seen each other at their absolute worst and had chosen to stay. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, Jed, yes." But as they embraced, a cold thought intruded on her happiness. A golden-haired woman was still living just a few miles away, at the boarding house in town. A woman who had been promised a rich rancher. A woman who now knew that same rancher was marrying his nurse. Violet Rollins wasn't the type to go away quietly, and Tarnia had a terrible feeling that their story was far from over. The news of the wedding spread through Grey Rock like wildfire. Jed Clark, who had been so publicly jilted by the beautiful Violet Rollins, was now marrying the plain, quiet woman who had saved him. It was the story of the year, and Mrs. Henderson was in her element, organizing the biggest celebration the town had ever seen. Jed, true to his word, wanted to do things right. He rode into town, his legs still aching, and went straight to the boarding house. He had to face Violet. He had to tell her himself. He found her in the front parlor, looking as perfect as ever. When she saw him standing there, walking on his own, a flicker of something, regret, surprise, crossed her face before her polished mask slid back into place. "Jed," she said, her voice smooth as cream. "You're looking well. I came to tell you I'm getting married," he said, cutting straight to the point. "To Tarnia." Violet's smile was brittle. "Ah, yes, the little nursemaid. How charitable of you. I suppose you feel you owe her." "I don't owe her," Jed said, his voice cold. "I love her." "Love?" Violet laughed, a sharp, unpleasant sound. "You don't know the first thing about love. You know about land and cattle and hiding your inadequacies." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Don't think I didn't notice, Jed. The way you never read the paper yourself. The way you let your foreman handle all the correspondence. A big, powerful rancher who can't even write his own name. Is that what your little Tarnia fell in love with? A lie?" Jed's jaw tightened. "She knows, and it doesn't matter to her." "Oh, it will," Violet hissed, her composure finally cracking. "She's marrying you for this ranch, for security. The same reasons I came here. The only difference is, she's a better actress. But you made a promise to me first, Jed. I have your letters. Letters promising me this life. You walked away from this life," Jed said, turning to leave. "You walked away from me." "You'll regret this," she shrieked after him, her voice echoing in the quiet boarding house. "I won't let you just toss me aside. I'll tell everyone the truth about you." Jed walked out into the street, his heart heavy. He wasn't afraid of Violet's threats. The whole town could know his secret for all he cared. Tarnia knew, and that was all that mattered. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Violet was a cornered animal, and cornered animals were always the most dangerous. The wedding day arrived, crisp and clear. The church was packed. Everyone from 3 counties seemed to be there. Tarnia stood at the back, her hands trembling, with Clint by her side to walk her down the aisle. She wore a simple but beautiful white dress that the church ladies had helped her sew. She looked like a bride. She felt like a soldier heading into battle. As the music started, she took a deep breath. She saw Jed waiting for her at the altar, his eyes filled with so much love that it made her forget everything else. All her fears, all her doubts, all the threats from Violet, they all melted away. This was right. This was her future. The ceremony was beautiful. Reverend Walker spoke of love and commitment, of finding strength in another's heart. Jed and Tarnia said their vows, their voices clear and strong. They were so close. Just a few more words and they would be husband and wife. Then Reverend Walker spoke the fateful lines. If there is anyone present who knows of any lawful reason why these two should not be wed, speak now or forever hold your peace. A heavy silence fell over the church. It was supposed to be a formality, a moment of quiet before the final blessing. But the silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 3. And then, from the back of the church, a voice rang out, sharp and clear. I object. Every single head in the church swiveled around. There, standing in the last pew, was Violet Rollins. She looked magnificent, like an avenging angel, her face pale with fury, her eyes blazing. I object to this marriage, she declared, her voice trembling with manufactured outrage. This man is a fraud. He promised himself to me, in letters he didn't even write himself. A collective gasp went through the congregation. The whispers started, a snake-like hissing that filled the holy space. Violet strode down the aisle, a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon in her hand. He can't even read or write, she announced to the shocked faces. He had his foreman, Clint Vaughn, write these letters, pretending to be an educated, eloquent man. He lied to me. He lied to all of you. The church erupted into chaos. All eyes shot from Violet to Jed to a stone-faced Clint. Reverend Walker banged his Bible on the pulpit. Order! Order! Jed stood his ground, his face grim. He looked at Tarnia, a silent apology in his eyes. Then he turned to the congregation. It's true, he said, his voice ringing with authority, silencing the crowd. I cannot read. I never pretended to be anything I wasn't. I am a rancher. I work with my hands. Clint here helps me with my paperwork. He then looked directly at Violet. And yes, he wrote those letters. But the words, the feelings, they were mine. I offered you a chance to build a life with me. I didn't lie about that. But when you saw me at my weakest, you turned your back and walked away. Because you weren't the man you pretended to be, Violet shot back. And you were? A new voice cut in. It was Tarnia. She stepped forward, her eyes locked on Violet. You didn't care about the words in the letters, she said, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the church. You cared about the land, the money. You wanted the prize, not the man. You say he's a fraud, but you're the one who only loves the parts of a person that benefit you. Love isn't about perfection. It's about showing up when things are broken. The town was silent, watching this incredible showdown. But Violet wasn't done. She had one last card to play, one more secret to reveal. Oh, showing up? Violet sneered, turning her venomous gaze on Clint. Why don't you ask the foreman about showing up? He didn't just write the letters. He made sure I wouldn't want to stay. A confused murmur rippled through the crowd. What was she talking about? Clint's face was a mask of stone. She's lying, he said flatly. Am I? Violet's smile was triumphant. Tell them, Clint. Tell them about the accident with the wagon. Tell them how you made sure one of the wheel pins was loose. Not enough to kill him. Oh no, just enough to cause a little spill. Just enough to make sure the strong, successful rancher looked like a broken, pathetic mess when his new bride arrived. The church fell into a stunned, absolute silence. You could have heard a feather drop. Tanya stared at Clint, her mind reeling. The accident wasn't an accident? Jed turned slowly to face his foreman, his best friend. Clint, he said, his voice a dangerous whisper. Is this true? Clint looked at Jed, his expression cracking for the first time. There was no defiance in his eyes, only a deep, painful loyalty. Yes, he said, his voice hoarse. It's true. He had seen Violet for what she was from the very beginning. He had read the greed in her letters, heard the calculation in her words. He knew she would destroy Jed. So he had arranged a test of character. He had sabotaged the wagon to see if she was the kind of woman who would stand by her man when he was down, or the kind who would run at the first sign of trouble. He had done it to protect Jed. He had done it out of love. But in doing so, he had nearly killed his best friend and had broken the law. The entire town stared, breathless. This wasn't just a wedding anymore. It was a trial. Jed stood between the woman he loved, the woman who had tried to destroy him, and the man who had been like a brother to him, a brother who had just confessed to a terrible crime. What would he do? The wedding, his reputation, his friendship with Clint, his entire future. It all hung in the balance, waiting for his next word. The air in the church was so thick with tension it was hard to breathe. Everyone was staring at Jed Clark, waiting for the explosion. They were waiting for him to call for the sheriff, to curse Clint, to throw him off his land forever. Jed looked at Clint, his friend of 8 years, the man who had stood by him through droughts and blizzards, the man who had just confessed to betraying him in the most twisted way imaginable. He saw the regret in Clint's eyes, but he also saw the fierce, unwavering loyalty that had driven him to do such a crazy, dangerous thing. Then Jed looked at Tanya. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. She was looking at him, trusting him to do the right thing. And finally he looked at Violet. She was smiling, a smug, victorious smile. She had done it. She had exposed all their secrets, shattered their perfect day, and turned them all against each other. She had lost the man, but she was going to make damn sure she won the war. Jed took a deep breath. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it filled the entire church. He didn't speak to Clint. He didn't speak to Violet. He spoke to Tanya. The day my wagon crashed, he said, his eyes never leaving hers, was the worst day of my life and the best day of my life. It was the day I lost everything I thought I wanted and the day I found everything I ever needed. He turned to the stunned congregation. My foreman, my friend, did a terrible thing. He broke the law and he put my life in danger. He did it for the wrong reasons, but with the right heart. He was trying to protect me. What he did was wrong. He paused, letting the words sink in. But what Violet did was worse. He pointed a finger at her, and his voice was like steel. She saw a man in pain and felt disgust. She saw a man in need and walked away. Clint's crime was one of misguided loyalty. Hers was a crime of the soul. There's no law against having a cold heart, but there should be. He walked over to Clint and put a hand on his shoulder. You and I will have words later, he said, his voice low. But you're still my friend. You're still my foreman. Then he walked back to the altar, took Tarnia's hands in his and faced the preacher. Reverend, he said, his voice booming through the church. We've had our interruption. Now, if you'd be so kind as to finish marrying me to this woman. For a second, the whole town was frozen. Then someone at the back started to clap. It was one of the ranch hands. Then another joined in, and another. Within seconds, the entire church, minus one person, erupted in thunderous applause and cheers. They weren't just clapping for a wedding. They were clapping for loyalty, for forgiveness, for the kind of love that wasn't afraid of the truth. Violet stood alone in the aisle, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. No one was looking at her anymore. She had played all her cards and lost. Humiliated, she turned and fled from the church, the sound of the town's celebration chasing her out the door. The rest of the wedding was a blur of joy. When Jed and Tanya were finally pronounced husband and wife, the cheer was so loud it probably rattled windows in the next town over. The reception was the stuff of legends. The whole town celebrated with them, eating and dancing until the sun came up. It felt like more than just a party. It felt like a new beginning for the whole community. As the years passed, the story of Jed and Tarnia's wedding became a local myth, a tale told to newcomers to explain the character of the town. Violet Rollins was never seen in Grey Rock again. Clint Vaughn stayed on as Jed's foreman, his loyalty repaid with a forgiveness that made their bond stronger than ever. Jed and Tarnia built a life together that was even better than the one in the letters. With Tarnia's sharp mind and Jed's hard work, the ranch prospered. But more than that, their house became a home, filled with warmth, laughter, and eventually, the cries of their own children. Tarnia taught Jed how to read, sitting with him by the fire late at night, his large hand tracing the letters her patient finger pointed to. It was a life of simple, profound happiness. Then about 5 years after the wedding, a letter arrived. It was forwarded from Kansas, addressed to a Miss Tarnia McCall. The handwriting was elegant, educated. Tarnia opened it with a curious frown. The letter was from a man named Samuel Whitman. He was writing to inform her that his brother, a schoolteacher named Thomas Whitman, had passed away from pneumonia the previous winter. Tarnia's blood ran cold. Thomas Whitman, the schoolteacher. It was the other man she had written to, all those years ago, before she'd gotten the letter from Jed. The letter continued. Among his brother's things, Samuel had found a letter Tarnia had written. He had also found his brother's reply. A reply he had written, but had never gotten the chance to mail before he fell ill. In the letter, Thomas had been deeply impressed by Tarnia's character and was formally inviting her to come to his town, hoping she might become a wife to him and a mother to his 2 young children. He had chosen her. The schoolteacher had chosen her, too. If that letter had been mailed, she never would have gone to Grey Rock. She never would have met Jed. She would have had a completely different life. She stood on her porch, staring at the letter, the world seeming to tilt on its axis. 2 men in 2 different towns had both wanted her. One path had led to this life, this love, this family. The other path had led to a life she could now only imagine. Just then, Jed came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. He read the letter over her shoulder, his body going still. "Do you ever wonder," he asked quietly, "about the other life you could have had?" Tarnia looked out at the rolling hills of their ranch, at her children playing in the yard, at the mountains that had become the backdrop to her life. She thought about the man who had died hoping she would come, and the 2 children who had been left without a mother. A pang of sadness went through her for them, for the life that never was. But regret? No. She leaned back against her husband, the man who was real, the man who was hers. "No," she said softly, "because every choice, every wrong turn, every accident, it all led me right here, to you." But that isn't the end of the story, because there was one last line in the letter from Samuel Whitman, a postscript that Jed had missed. Tarnia read it, and a gasp escaped her lips. "P.S.," it said, "I feel I should tell you, Thomas was not my only brother. We had a younger half-brother from our father's first marriage, a stubborn boy who ran away from home years ago to make his fortune out west. He never learned to read or write, but he was the hardest worker I ever knew. We haven't heard from him in over a decade, but his name was Jedediah Clark. Jed was Thomas Whitman's brother. The man she married and the man she almost married were brothers who had lost track of each other years ago. It wasn't a choice between 2 different men, 2 different paths. It was a choice between 2 brothers. It seemed fate, or destiny, or whatever you want to call it, was determined to make Tarnia McCall a part of this family one way or another. She had chosen the right brother, she had chosen the right life, and she had found her way home, to a family she never even knew she was looking for. And what a story that is. It just goes to show you that sometimes the wrong path leads you to exactly the right place. If you enjoyed this story, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, because the tales I have coming up are only going to get crazier. And leave a comment below. Do you think Clint was a hero or a villain for what he did? I can't wait to read what you think. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.